after 2,000 years. Finding places like this is extremely important. I think that the most interesting thing when you enter is just trying to imagine how the space was back in antiquity.
At the height of its power, the Roman Empire was geographically enormous. The Roman military was just an awesome fighting machine, and in the end, it could always outmaneuver, outfight, outstay pretty much any opposition that was put in its way.
The glory of Rome was the envy of the world, but its sword was merciless to any who defied its authority. After Emperor Nero destroyed Rome by fire in 64 AD, he ordered the annihilation of the city's Christians, who he blamed for the fires that devastated the city.
Nero needed scapegoats. There were rumors starting to spread that Nero himself had begun the fire. Christians seem to have been a kind of convenient collection of oddballs, weirdos, freaks. Nero picks on them because they are malevolent, superstitious devotees of a strange kind of cult, and therefore exactly the kind of people who the Roman people would regard with the utmost suspicion.
Many of the people who had died before for the Christian religion, and we call them martyrs, they were buried inside the catacombs. So the catacombs became a very special place. As an art historian, I'm really interested about the decoration of the graves. The Christians, all of them say, "Sleep in peace." This message of resting in peace before the resurrection.
For hope of deliverance, many Christians turn to the writings of the Hebrew prophet Daniel. Writing in 605 BC, Daniel had a vision from God that foretold the rise and fall of future kingdoms. Animal beasts were used to represent the kingdoms. The lion of Babylon, the bear of Medo-Persia, and the leopard of Greece would all rise and fall. A fourth beast, Rome, would emerge and rule in one form or another until the end of the ages. In the 4th century, the fate of Rome would forever be changed by one of its 4 emperors, Constantine. In the spring of 312 AD, Constantine set his eyes on total control of the empire. With an army of 40,000 soldiers, he led his troops south towards the Eternal City.
Constantine was bearing down on Rome, and his adversary Maxentius faces up to him. The battle is for certainly the control of Rome, in a sense for the soul of Rome, in that religious sense as well. The sources speak of Constantine having a vision in which he receives Christian symbols, and he puts these symbols on the weaponry, on the shields of his forces. So they go into battle under the protection of the Christian God as they see it. The combat is a hard-fought one. It ends up really with Maxentius's troops being slaughtered in the River Tiber by Constantine's men.
The defeated emperor is beheaded, and Constantine enters the ancient capital of the world in triumph as Caesar, and as he does so, he has the head of his defeated enemy on his spear. He ends up ruler of the entire empire.
Victorious and proclaimed as emperor, Constantine brought the persecution of Christians to an end. Christianity became the religion of Rome. One God for one empire.
When a persecuted minority suddenly becomes either the majority or comes into some power, you now have the problems not of persecution, but of power. How do you handle power? How do you handle people who disagree with you? Now you're the one holding the reins.
Christianity has been acceptable under Constantine, and now under Theodosius, it's paganism that is not acceptable. From then on, Christianity, I think, is, if you like, officially dominant rather than just officially acceptable.
Daniel's prophecy had described Rome as a beast, dreadful, terrible, and exceedingly strong. It depicted 10 horns on the head of the Roman beast, representing the 10 barbarian tribes that would prevail and occupy the lands once under Roman rule. Daniel foretold that 3 of these horns, or kingdoms, would be uprooted. The tribes of the Vandals, Ostrogoths, and Visigoths were uprooted, just as Daniel had foretold, 1,000 years before the events. Their demise paved the way for the rise of a little horn, a small kingdom that would rise from within Rome. This little horn power would stand in the place of God and rule for over 1,000 years. Daniel's prophecy outlined a religio-political power rising from the ashes of the Roman Empire to wage war against God and his people in an epic struggle for dominion. The prophecy had foretold that the little horn power would seek to change times and laws of God. Far from the church bells of Rome sat a series of islands, untamed by Roman armies. Its wild oceans still taunt sailors today.
I've been a fisherman since I left school. I used to go out fishing with my father when I was a young boy, and that's how I learned how to fish. Been fishing all these years, and it's a job I like, and I'll never do anything else.
Celtic Christians trace their heritage back to first-century believers who handed down their faith from generation to generation.
This barbarous island beyond the reaches of the ocean, which had not been part of the Roman Empire and therefore had not been subjected to the process of Christianization that had affected the provinces under Constantine and his heirs, it ends up becoming this kind of blazing beacon of Christian faith.
For almost 1,000 years or so, they were one of the few holdouts to true biblical Christianity in a world that was being swept by political and otherwise traditional influences. That isolation, if you will, actually served them very well.
Fishing's not always the best job to do. You have your good days and your bad days. You've really got to respect the sea because it can change very easy. It can be nice one minute and very bad the next.
These windswept islands became a battleground for truth. The Sabbath, a weekly time set aside for remembrance and rest, was to become the object of the little horn power's most intense hatred.
Pope Gregory III had warned his priests against the Celts and against the charge of, quote, Judaizing. And by that they mean keeping the seventh-day Sabbath.
You know, you see the Sabbath all the way back from Genesis, where God instituted the Sabbath. You see the Old Testament, you see Jesus keeping it, the apostles keeping it. And so, of course, a New Testament believer, without any other influence of tradition or something, if you just pick up the Bible and you see what did Jesus teach in his word, what did Jesus practice in his life, and then just continue it on just like the apostles had, Sabbath keeping would not be a foreign, new, strange concept. It's what's written in the scriptures. They just kept going.
Christ worshipped on the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, and so had his followers. It was a day to do good, to rest, to worship God as Creator and remember his goodness.
The Sabbath day is uniquely important, the seventh-day Sabbath, above any other day. And that is because on that day, we see in the Ten Commandments, in the fourth commandment, when it's outlined who he is, it shows that he's the creator God. It gives the domain of what he created, and it gives his name, his personal name. So we see that there are three elements there that indicate this particular day has his signature. This is a revelation of who God is.
The little horn power conspired to replace God's sacred Sabbath with a pagan substitute. At a church council in the 4th century, it was decreed that all who would not work on the Sabbath were Judaizers and should be excommunicated.
Rome, in its paganism, had worshipped the sun itself as an object of veneration. Constantine practiced this in his own life. He was a worshiper of the sun. But he also wanted to merge Christianity in that, and somehow he found the venerable day of the sun as a placeholder that could bring all these other pagan and somehow Christian practices together. Now we have the resurrection of Jesus Christ on this day. We have the pagan practices that go before it. It's a natural day of worship, and here we have the right being to worship. Let's fuse these together and basically create an amalgamation of worship practices and place it on that day.
The Church of Rome had set up a new day of worship to rival God's Sabbath, claiming a right reserved to God alone, to establish divine times and laws.
You see in both Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 as a sequence of kingdoms and nations, right? And you have Babylon, Medo Persia, Greece, and Rome. All of them do essentially the same things. They're military powers or they're conquering empires. They take over the subsequent one and the subsequent one after that. But when you get to this beast of Daniel 7, especially this little horn power that comes out of this fourth beast, this one's aim and objective is to take on God himself.
When I read Daniel 7, you've got this prophet writing centuries and centuries before, depicting the attempted change of the Sabbath by Rome to Sunday. Now, you might think, well, what's the big deal? Well, this is God's law. It says 10 commandments, and it says the seventh day is the Sabbath. And what gives some human power, some man-made power, the right to come in and change it? To try to usurp that is an attempt to usurp the role and authority of God himself.
For hundreds of years, the Celtic Church resisted Roman darkness with the light of God's Word. They persisted as a lamp shining on a hill, and their missionaries influenced thousands across Europe, encouraging them to remain faithful amid the oncoming flood of persecution. The prophecy had foretold that the little horn power would oppress the saints of the Most High. Other prophecies said it would not relent until it was drunk with the blood of martyrs. In response, God's people fled to the wilderness, to a place prepared by God. Nestled below these rugged mountain peaks are valleys that were once the hidden homes of faithful believers.
I have lived in the area of Torre Pellice since I was born. I'm impressed by the beauty of the mountain. The forests in the valley are very dense, populated by trees, and sometimes it's very difficult to find the path to reach the summit.
In the peaceful valleys of these Alps lived a people who traced their heritage and beliefs to the time of the apostles. The Waldenses, the people of the valleys.
They were up in the mountains, and it was kind of hard to get to them. And they did as much as they possibly could for as long as they possibly could, try to avoid the Roman Church and the unfortunate corruptions that came in to the church.
The most characteristic thing that Waldenses seem to have believed is that the claims to spiritual authority and spiritual superiority claimed by the Catholic priesthood were bogus. When the church tries to discipline them and tries to forbid them to do what they're doing, then they witness against the church hierarchy.
My family traces the history to the Waldenses. Waldenses were mountain people without connected to the big city.
What today we call the Roman Catholic Church, it was actually a revolutionary institution. The church, led by figures in Rome and by the figure of the Pope, embarked on this great process that they called Reformatio, the remaking of the world. And they wanted to do that because they wanted to purge what they saw as earthly sin from the fabric of the Christian people.
From the 1230s onwards, you have the beginning of the medieval practice of Inquisition. Judges traveling around various bits of Europe looking for trouble. When the Waldensian communities realized that they were under legal threat, they become more clandestine, they become more secretive.
The caves of the valley became the Waldenses' refuge to escape the watchful eye of their hunters.
The Roman Church felt that it was obliged to persecute because the church believed that as long as there were obstinate dissenters around, they were persuading others and were therefore leading souls to spend eternity in hell.
The Waldenses were a particular irritant to the power of the church at that time. You have here a people who, in their simplicity, in their humility, are a standing rebuke to the very system you're trying to build. They weren't intending to be smug or arrogant or something like that, but it just showed such a stark contrast to what the church had become versus what the church was supposed to be.
The Roman Church had the power to wipe out heresy when it saw heresy and didn't see the problem with meting out this kind of earthly justice, supposedly with this heavenly mandate. When you have a church that has that kind of power, that actually thinks, We can wipe out heresy. It's simple. And we're doing it with God's authority. It's the ugliest thing in history because people then have no impunity. They don't hesitate.
The Waldenses are such an irritant to Rome at this point. Pope Innocent VIII issues a decree, a bull, and he calls for their extermination. In fact, calls for them to be crushed like venomous snakes.
Essentially, they become enemies of the state. Their property is up for grabs. Their lives are not valuable. Anyone who commits any action against them is completely absolved of any wrongdoing. And so essentially, they are fair game. It's open hunting season for this group of people who simply want to honor God.
In 1487, armies under papal orders marched on the valley, determined to purge it of its inhabitants. But the mountains proved their fortress as they escaped amid dense fog. Rome did not relent. In the years that followed, the persecution intensified. Fleeing to the caves of the towering Mount Castelluzzo, those who were found were thrown from its heights, their blood spilt in the dirt that had fed and protected them for centuries. The prophecy foretold that the little horn power would persecute the people of God. The Waldenses, like hundreds of thousands of Jews, Muslims, and Protestants, were tortured and killed by the Roman Church for thinking differently. For almost 1,000 years, Europe had been engulfed in a deepening darkness. But the dawn of a new era beckoned. Daniel's prophecy foretold that the little horn power would engage in a boastful war against God. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people. This power would cast truth to the ground and speak in the place of God.
Eisenach has a long history of amazing musicians, dating back to the 17th century, as it is the birthplace of Johann Sebastian Bach. Musicians like myself are inspired by his talent. The cello I perform with dates back hundreds of years to the times of Johann Sebastian Bach.
Emerging from a German monastery, a young monk set in motion a reform that would destroy the world he knew. His name? Martin Luther.
Luther visits Rome and then does all the things that a faithful pilgrim to Rome would do. One of them is to climb the so-called Sancta Scala on his knees. The church put out there for these pilgrims, they said, if you climb these stairs on your knees and pray these prayers, we can guarantee that your godless grandfather who's in purgatory and will be there for another 40,000 years suffering, that he will get out of purgatory. Luther dutifully, as a young man, jumps through these hoops and in this case, climbs these stairs on his knees faithfully for the sake of his grandfather's soul. And when he gets to the top, he had this profoundly horrifying thought enter his mind. What if it isn't true?
The city Luther departed was to become the focal point for a vision of splendor, of a scale never before seen. Plans to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica were announced, and no expense was to be spared. Indulgences, or certificates to release a soul from hell, were sold by the church to pay for the construction. Access to heaven was now sold in the marketplace. Guilt had been monetized, and for great profit. Forgiveness of sin was no longer considered a free gift of God. Pilgrimages, self-mutilation, and hours of painful prostration stood in place of Christ's redeeming blood. Souls who sought peace with God turned to confession with a human priest, unable to cleanse the sinner of guilt and shame. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was worshipped as the Queen of Heaven and mediator between God and humans. Hosts of other saints quickly joined her, their relics and bodies venerated and traded as tokens of fate and fortune. Papal councils proclaimed the Pope as Holy Father and God on earth, infallible when speaking in council. To question the Pope was to question God himself. The fear of an eternally burning hell and purgatory were taught from pulpits to guarantee compliance. Any who dared challenge the Pope's authority were met with fire and the sword. With his eyes open to the grace of God, Luther turned his face from Rome, never to look back.
He was simply going to go where he felt the truth would lead him. He comes on these various scriptures that make it plain that it is only by faith that I can be saved.
Over the course of the centuries of the papacy's control of Europe, ways of understanding scripture have been erected that have blocked the individual Christian off from gaining what scripture can provide. Luther comes to see the Roman Church as being a pagan temple full of perverted images that must be pulled down. And therefore, the person who presides over this, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, this is Antichrist. This is the whore of Babylon. This is a figure who is in a way worse than a pagan because he is kind of dressing himself up in the robes of a good Christian, which therefore are all the more dangerous and pernicious.
Beginning with the aggressive sale of indulgences to fatten the pockets of the church and the persistent reticence of Rome to rectify the abuses of power, Luther confessed his suspicion that the earthly Roman potentate was the very Antichrist mentioned by Paul.
Anti doesn't just mean against something, but in the biblical sense, it means to be in the place of something. So this is not just a power that wants to get rid of God or argue against God or defy God. It wants to replace God.
For identifying the Pope as Antichrist and publishing works against the Church, Luther was summoned to stand trial before the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at the German town of Worms.
Luther goes there having no idea what he's facing. When he's finally questioned, he's thinking he's going to get an opportunity to say his piece, but the papal delegate effectively tells him, we're not interested in what you have to say. Yes or no? Do you revoke everything you've said and all these bad things you've written or not? Yes or no? Yes or no? But he thought, how can I do that? I've written all these books, many of which you approve of. What in which books do you disapprove of? What do you need me to recant? And they really wouldn't tell him. So in the end, he's stuck, and he says, based on what you've said, and based on my conscience and my understanding of things before God, I have no choice but to say what I have said. Here I stand, I can do no other. It deserves to be known as the moment when Luther faced the Pope and all of the power in the world and said, I choose God.
Luther was condemned as a heretic, and his life was in danger. He departed Worms to return home as an enemy of the state.
Luther has said his piece at Worms. Now, what's going to happen? No one knows. So he is allowed ostensibly to go back home to Wittenberg, but they believe that on the way to Wittenberg, or maybe in Wittenberg, he will be arrested, hauled to Rome, and executed.
Luther leaves Worms, probably the most famous person in Europe. He's heading back to Wittenberg, and then something happens that makes the story even more sensational. A band of horsemen descend on Luther and his party. They're all armed with crossbows, hold the party up. They take Luther, they gallop off, and no one has any idea where Luther's gone. Everybody is now talking about Luther.
In a secret plot, Luther was kidnapped by his own supporters. For almost a year, Luther would be disguised as a knight within the walls of this mighty fortress, Wartburg Castle.
He was hidden there, disguised as a knight. He grew a beard, he grew out his tonsure, he dressed as a knight. No one at the Wartburg who was there had any idea that this is the monk, Martin Luther.
These were really difficult times for Luther. He was alone, he was under protective custody, so he contented himself and occupied himself by writing.
While confined to this small room, Luther translated the New Testament into the language of the common people.
Luther knew that if we could get the words of God and the stories of God into the hands of the average person, they won't just be following their leaders, they can learn for themselves what God says. When he realized that, it didn't just change Luther, it ended up changing literally the whole world in which we live.
Luther's flame of hope blazed across the empire. A mighty fortress is our God. His famed anthem of the Reformation would stir hearts for ages to come.
What he did was absolutely revolutionary. There's no way for us to comprehend how the world changed when that book was made available to anyone who wanted it.
Luther was not without his personal faults, but his reform challenged 1,000 years of human tradition and introduced the grace of God to the common people. God's word had broken through Europe's long and dark night. Daniel had foretold that the little horn power would experience 1,260 years of political and religious supremacy. But the same prophecy said that at an appointed time, its dominion would come to an end.
The magnificent architecture and rich history of Paris make it one of my favorite places to paint. Everywhere I look, I see beauty and light contrasted against darkness.
Both sides in the Reformation are absolutely convinced that they are right and that the future of the Christian people is at stake.
The initial response of the Roman Catholic Church to the Reformation was, in effect, all-out war. They doubled down on their errors as a result of feeling that, you know, the Protestants are implacable enemies.
In the late 18th century, Paris descended into chaos. Cobbled streets ran red with blood. As France, Rome's old friend, prepared to lance a deadly wound, Europe's long night of spiritual darkness was coming to an end.
Streets and squares that were once places of revolution and bloodshed are now home to people seeking a future of peace and love.
The revolutionaries in France saw themselves as sweeping away the idols of an old order. And these idols were the monarchy, the nobility, and the church. And the conviction was that if they swept these idols away, then a new era of universal brotherhood would come in. There is an ambition to remake the world, to purge it of idolatry and oppression, and to bring people into the light of a new age.
From the Reformation to the 1700s, internal wars of religion ravaged Europe. The decimation, the death, and the carnage that occurred left Europe, one scholar says, it was almost akin to the Black Death, how it was left. And all this was in the name of religion.
In the mind of French philosopher Voltaire, the reformers had not done enough to bring down the Pope's authority.
Voltaire had been born in the Catholic Church, he'd been educated by the Jesuits, but he ended up kind of condemning them as frauds and pedophiles, and he came to view Christianity with a kind of hatred that bordered on the obsessional. What really got him going was what he called l'infâme, this kind of infamous monstrosity, by which basically he meant the Catholic Church. This idea that the Catholic Church had accrued to itself the right to torture to death people who were invariably innocent. And that's what he wanted. Écraser l'infâme, he said, destroy this infamous horror.
Rome had presented a distorted picture of God's character as tyrannical and his law as oppressive. And the logical consequence was the rejection of both God and his word. Rome's iron heel had stomped out all civility from the masses. They identified God with Rome and would have none of either. As a result, the faithless and degraded masses revolted with the brutality and aggression that was felt around the world.
Voltaire did not accomplish his aim. But another Frenchman, at the end of the 1,260 years of dominance, fulfilled a key detail of Daniel's prophecy. In the summer of 1798, French troops, under the leadership of General Berthier, marched south to Rome and occupied the city.
Napoleon sends Berthier down into Rome. You have this dramatic confrontation where the general marches into the Holy See and claims that the papacy is done. This is now a republic. This is now a civil power, not a religious one. The Pope refuses to relent. They take him captive, and he's moved from prison to prison, where he eventually dies in exile in France.
This event was a huge blow to the Roman Catholic Church, and when it happened, the 1260 years of its dominance came to an end.
Established religion had been cast aside for the religion of the secular. The old order had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Daniel had foretold that a power would rise from Rome's ashes, challenge the authority and laws of God, distort his character and teachings, and crush any who defy its decrees. But God's people would endure to the end. Reformers stood for truth, though the heavens fell. Revolutionaries inflicted a deadly wound and brought an end to Roman oppression.
What you're seeing in Daniel chapter 7 is a deep, unmoving love of God. He's outlining a system that is working in cohort and concert with the enemy of our souls. Every person who is a part of that faith, every person who has ever decided to believe simply because this is how they were taught, he gives them a simple call: come out, come out.
Kings and emperors, popes and peasants have all fought for dominion. Dominion over empires and even the souls of humankind. But light shined in darkness, and darkness did not overcome it. God's character was revealed through his words and the lives of his people. Today, the same God of grace who called his people from darkness to light invites all to know him and enter his kingdom. A kingdom whose dominion will never pass away.